Good evening. After more than 27 hours of continuous session, the House of Representatives today finally passed a bill that could make it possible for Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace to debate on television. However, the bill now must go to the Senate, which has already approved two-way debates involving only Mr. Nixon and Mr. Humphrey. The Senate is expected to approve the House version, and if it does, there would be no legal obstacles to a three-way debate before Election Day. Richard Nixon, however, still insists he will debate only with the Vice President and not with George Wallace. The marathon House session was the longest since 1853, when the House debated for 2 days and nights over a slavery issue. For part of the time early this morning, the doors to the House chamber were actually locked. For a report on this bizarre day on Capitol Hill, here is ABC's Irv Chapman.
The House of Representatives doesn't ever have filibusters. Well, hardly ever. There are delaying tactics available in the rule book, and for one long legislative day, those tactics were put to use. The target was a bill to allow the broadcasting networks to invite candidates Humphrey, Nixon, and Wallace to a series of joint appearances or debates. When the bill came up shortly after yesterday afternoon, a group of young Republicans began the big stall. They demanded quorum call after quorum call. They refused the usual consent to dispense with reading aloud the 68-page journal of the preceding day's session. After roll call number 33, the Democratic majority at 5:30 in the morning demanded that the doors be locked to keep those present from departing. They stayed locked for the next 2.5 hours. The Democratic leadership saw only one reason for the legislative nightmare, and that is Republican desire to spare Richard Nixon from having to debate on television. The young Republicans, however, insisted they were only trying to dramatize their case for congressional and election reform bills they say the Democratic leadership has stalled.
Both of these bills are important. Both have been bottled up for in excess of a year and filibustered by the Democratic leadership. And it's our conviction that it's exceedingly important that they be scheduled this year before the House adjourns.
The tactics adopted by the Democrats, I think, showed the degree and the extremes to which they would go to prevent us from having come before the House these two measures on congressional reorganization and electoral reform. One of those measures, which I was personally involved in, related to the majority, in spite of a quorum being present, which could have done business, the majority taking action to lock us all up in the chamber, something I said was unconstitutional and violated the civil rights of the congressman. I made this point by getting out of the chamber and asking whether the Speaker wished to have the Sergeant at Arms arrest me, which he did not do, I think, backing down therefore from the principal point, but showing the extent and the degree where at this late point in the session apparently they want to quash any consideration of these bills and just push through legislation that they happen to want, or that perhaps the Vice President, the presidential candidate of their party happens to want.
When the bill came up for a final vote late this afternoon, it passed overwhelmingly as expected. And both parties set out to make the political most of what had happened in the long day of the House of Representatives. This is Irv Chapman, ABC News, Capitol Hill.
Despite the House action today, it is still unlikely that Richard Nixon will agree to a debate. ABC's Howard K. Smith, who has observed Mr. Nixon's debating skill at close range, explains why.
In the year 1960, this reporter sat in front of cameras between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy and watched Nixon lose the election in 1 hour of prime time in the first great debate. Nixon was not defeated on the merits of debate. In fact, my arbitrary score gave him half a point more than Kennedy got. He was not even defeated by bad makeup, as the tradition now has it. He was beaten by psychology. He walked into the studio looking distraught. He knew that he, the famous vice president, had made a mistake in agreeing to that debate. He could gain nothing from it. Kennedy walked in like an eager athlete. He was not then famous and knew he could only gain, and he did. Earlier this year, Nixon foresaw a close election and was in favor of a debate at which he's very skilled. However, as things have developed, he's back where he was in 1960, way out in front, and has nothing to gain and an election to lose by some small misstep on television. Mr. Nixon says that Wallace is the obstacle, and he has certainly won. I have refereed 2 of Mr. Wallace's debates, and he's a savage opponent, uninhibited by the likelihood that he will win the election. However, if Mr. Nixon really wanted a debate only with Humphrey, all they would have to do is to hire a hall and leave the doors open. TV would be there. That's not a statement of ABC policy. It's the news judgment of a reporter who knows what attracts cameras. It's reasonable to think that Mr. Nixon doesn't want to debate anybody, as President Johnson did not want to 4 years ago, for it's an unnecessary risk for a front runner. But it now remains to be seen if today's vote turns the risk around and threatens Nixon with loss of faith unless he does debate. This is Howard K. Smith in Washington.
In the event the full Congress completes action on the Equal Time Bill, ABC News will again invite Mr. Nixon and Mr. Humphrey to debate, and will invite Mr. Wallace to appear on the same program. CBS and NBC have also contacted the three candidates to start discussions about the proposed debate or series of debates. In a moment, a report on the Paris peace talks.
Cherry Tums for the tummy? Doesn't sound like medicine.
No law says medicine has to taste bad to be good.
Lemon Tums, how sweet. But I need real medicine.
No law says medicine has to taste bad to be good.
Orange Tums?
No law says...
But wintergreen Tums?
Sure. Now Tums comes in 4 more flavors, as well as good old peppermint.
Tastes like candy.
They're still big medicine. Tests of a famous medical center prove Tums fights acid stomach better than every leading pill and liquid tested. It would take 1, 2, 3 teaspoons of this expensive liquid to give you the acid-fighting power in 1 Tums. Try cherry, lemon, wintergreen, orange Tums. Or good old peppermint.
I guess no law says medicine has to taste bad to be good.
No change, no movement, no progress. That sums up the 25th meeting in Paris today between American and North Vietnamese negotiators. There was a brief flurry of excitement over a statement by Xuan Thuy, Hanoi's chief negotiator, who suggested the war might be brought to an end before President Johnson leaves office if the president will order an end to all bombing of North Vietnam. However, Ambassador Harriman and other American officials see nothing really new in Thuy's statement and regard it as still a demand for an unconditional end to the bombing, with no indication the North Vietnamese will also de-escalate. The firmness of the American position was underscored in Washington today by the President. Mr. Johnson welcomed New Zealand's Prime Minister Keith Holyoake to the White House and used the occasion to again express his view that the war continues because of Hanoi's refusal to make peace.
Our struggle is not yet at an end, Mr. Prime Minister, but this much can be said, sir. It has never been clearer that the enemy will fail to force his political goals by military means. And in that vital sense, aggression has suffered a clear and a significant defeat. And it is significant, too, I think, that America's initiatives, as well set out in the statement of March 31, have opened the way for the aggressor to make peace. The nations and peace-loving peoples of the world have found it a positive invitation to de-escalation and to honorable settlement of this conflict. And we wait only for the other side to act with us, as all reasonable and humane men pray that we will act. One day the war in Vietnam will end. No man can foretell when, but the day will surely come. And we work and we pray so that it may come soon.
In Saigon tonight, there are rumors of an attempted coup against President Thieu. However, the ABC News Bureau in Saigon reports these rumors seem to be unfounded. United States Marines today beat back an attack by North Vietnamese forces on the Green Beret camp at Tuong Duc. Otherwise, there was little ground action. 4,000 paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division have been moved from positions near the demilitarized zone down south to Saigon's western flank to guard infiltration routes from the Cambodian border. Next, this day in politics.
Sure beats smoking.
What beats smoking?
This cherry-flavored lozenge called Nicoban. Nicoban helps satisfy your tobacco hunger. Helps control your appetite, too.
Can Nicoban really help me break the cigarette habit?
You bet. For years, Nicoban has been recommended by doctors to help people cut down on smoking, and often without gaining weight. So if you want real help in breaking the cigarette habit, try Nicoban.
Nicoban sure beats smoking.
Honey, it's 3 in the morning.
I can't sleep.
When simple nervous tension keeps you awake, take Sominex as directed for 100% safe sleep.
Sominex contains 3 medical ingredients to bring on restful sleep.
Take Sominex tonight and sleep. Safe and restful sleep, sleep, sleep.
Take 2 Sominex tablets.
And sleep.
Now also in capsules, hundreds of sleep-inducing granules.
In every Sominex capsule. Try it.
Last night, Senator Eugene McCarthy refused to endorse Vice President Hubert Humphrey. However, despite the continuing disunity in the Democratic Party, the Humphrey campaign seems to be picking up steam. A report now from ABC's Lou Chaffee with the Humphrey campaign in Boston.
Despite the fact that Senator McCarthy has refused to endorse him, the Vice President was not plagued by peace demonstrators here today in Boston on his second visit. And this is the place where the organized heckling began 3 weeks ago. It was obvious that the Vice President wanted McCarthy's support and was disappointed he did not get it. But it seemed to make little difference as far as the crowds were concerned. Humphrey's spirits rose considerably as he was greeted by a cheering, enthusiastic people in Boston, a far cry from the heckling that greeted him 3 weeks ago. And he was in good form as he spoke to a group of students outside a hotel. Many of the students probably were in that group of hecklers 3 weeks ago.
We got a late start. We had a lot of fights amongst ourselves because we didn't always understand what each of us were thinking about. I think the next president has to understand that young people have something to say and he has to be willing to listen. We're trying to sell an idea about this country, about what it can be. And I want you to listen to those ideas. I know my opposition floats more balloons than I do. But I'm going to float more good ideas than he does.
Those hecklers, by the way, have not been active for almost 2 weeks now. And Humphrey, for the time being, no longer has that particular problem. But he still has some serious ones, problems called Richard Nixon and George Wallace. This is Lou Chaffee with the Humphrey campaign in Boston.
George Wallace says the national polls are rigged, and he says this is why the next major political poll will show him losing ground among voters. Wallace also charged today that Richard Nixon knows what the Gallup poll is going to say in advance. Wallace first made the charges in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and then repeated them in Albany, New York.
I might point out that he gave something away, Mr. Nixon did, when he said Wallace's support is beginning to flake off, which is not the case, which leads me to say that the prediction that I made last month, that the professional polls were going to show that I am going up some, but in October, the polls are going to show that I am receding, because in my judgment, this Eastern moneyed interest crowd are going have control of the polls, and they ought to be investigated in the next Congress because they are trying themselves to elect candidates by molding public opinion, by trying to point out a winner.
There has been no response from the camp of Richard Nixon to Wallace's charge that the polls are rigged. In Santa Monica, California today, Mr. Nixon was interrupted during a speech by hecklers who set up a chant of peace, peace, and there were others shouting, McCarthy, McCarthy. Mr. Nixon called on his audience to shout down the hecklers. Then he ignored the continuing uproar and protest from both sides and went on to complete his speech. In a moment, we'll have a look at a loyal Nixon campaigner.
This is a molecular model of poly-1,4-cyclohexylene dimethylene terephthalate. How about that? And I'm Joanna Barnes here to tell you what this unique molecule of Codel polyester fiber means in carpets. It's so special, it's patented.
Every room in your house comes alive because carpets of Codel bounce back
beautifully. Even a house full of kids can't keep Codell fiber down. That's why Codell is the fastest growing carpet fiber. If you can't remember the name Codell, ask for poly 1,4-cyclohexylene dimethylene terephthalate.
We also make 2,2,4-trimethyl-1,3-pentane diol monoisobutyrate.
But that doesn't go in carpets.
Codell fiber has come back.
Count on Codell, a member of the Eastman Kodak family.
There are really rather few campaign rules for the wife of a presidential candidate. A closer look at the way Mrs. Richard Nixon views her role in the presidential campaign from ABC's Marlene Sanders.
The wives of the presidential candidates have their own approaches to their jobs. Muriel Humphrey ventures out to campaign on her own, but Pat Nixon stays close by her husband's side. Richard Nixon likes having Pat along. I asked him whether she goes with him as moral support or to win votes.
Like most women in politics, she is a very good advisor, a very good critic of my speeches and also of my appearance. I usually don't stand straight, I understand. And also I believe she's quite effective in her political appeal, and I would let me say also that I think Mrs. Humphrey is very effective politically, and I respect Mrs. Humphrey just as I respect my own wife.
Private moments together are rare. There are appearances somewhere nearly every day, though the Nixon campaign takes a fairly leisurely pace. Mrs. Nixon's supporting role is a familiar one by now. The inevitable receiving line, the outstretched hands, the endless armfuls of flowers, usually roses, at every stop, and the smiles that require a smile in return. One must have a tolerance for crowds, no matter how great the inner longing for privacy may be. Mrs. Nixon is a good sport about what she feels is her obligation. In Williamsburg, Virginia, there was a welcome change from the usual routine. Richard Nixon wrote that the Checkers affair left a deep scar on his wife. I read her that section from his book, 6 Crises. From that time on, Pat was to go through campaign after campaign as a good trooper, but never again with the same feeling toward political life. She had lost the zest for it.
I have news for him. I really have zest in 1968 because I think he's the man who is best fitted for the job through experience and through the studies that he's made of history where he has learned from the lessons that we don't want to repeat. He also has a great diplomatic ability to work with people in other fields. And I feel that he's the best man for the job, and I have news for him. I'm working for him 18 hours a day.
Pat Nixon began campaigning back in 1946, and many miles have been logged since then. She seems to be a private kind of person, propelled into a public existence which she has learned to live with, if not to love. This is Marlene Sanders, ABC News.
In a moment, guest commentator James J. Kilpatrick takes a dim view of the 90th Congress.
You've got your troubles, Mac. The lawnmower's in the blink again, and now your cigarettes are quitting on you, too. They don't taste like much by now. But not if you smoke Viceroy. The good taste never quits. Viceroy's made different. The fine tobacco is perfectly matched to the Viceroy filter to make sure the good taste never quits. I'm sure lots of things quit, but at least you finally found a cigarette with good taste that never quits. Viceroy, king size or new extra length filter longs. The good taste never quits.
The Senate today passed a gun control bill forbidding the sale of all firearms and ammunition by mail. The bill, which was a compromise measure, now goes back to the House, where it is expected to pass, and then finally it will go to the White House for the President's signature. This may be one of the last actions of the 90th Congress, whose members seem anxious to adjourn. ABC guest commentator James Kilpatrick finds this feeling understandable.
The 90th Congress really hasn't been in session forever. But to press gallery cardinals, it seems as long as the top of the third. For this has been a disappointing Congress. The record isn't wholly bad, but a long list could be compiled by conservatives and liberals alike of things that were done that ought not to have been done, and of things that should have been done but weren't. Much of the sidestepping and indecision have resulted, in my own view, from a lack of leadership. On March 31st, Mr. Johnson announced his intention to take up the contemplative life. Since then, it's been downhill all the way. On paper, the Democrats had solid majorities, but this was only on paper. The old conservative coalition was working, yet it wasn't working well. The conservatives couldn't run things either. There hasn't been anyone really in charge. By the laws of physics governing the movement of hot air, some gaseous body should have rushed in to fill the vacuum. But though Capitol Hill is full of gaseous bodies, none has come along. To the absence of leadership, add a sense of frustration, almost a sense of helplessness. The Hill is not happy these days. A feeling persists that none of the old patent medicines is working. But no political doctors have come up with new remedies, so the old ones have to do. The war in Vietnam hangs upon Congress like a backache. Nothing will clear it up. Meanwhile, everything suffers. The record is flawed by half measures and whole failures. Back home, the voters are restless. The streets are full of demonstrators and the woods are full of Republicans. The Congress is tired, bad-tempered, and bothered by stomach acid. Tuesday night, they were locking them in to hold a quorum. Tonight, it may be worse. It's time to go home. And to everyone's relief, that's where the Congress is headed. This is James J. Kilpatrick in Washington.
Preparations for the Apollo 7 launch on Friday are proceeding smoothly at Cape Kennedy, and so are preparations for a possible flight around the moon in December. ABC science editor Jules Bergman reports from Cape Kennedy.
The world's biggest rocket, the 37-story high Saturn V, which may hurl 3 U.S. astronauts into orbit around the moon in December, was rolled out today for its 5-mile trip to its launching pad here at Complex 39. The 3 Apollo 8 pilots who will ride atop the Saturn V on its first manned flight, Colonel Frank Borman, Navy Captain Jim Lovell, and Major Bill Anders, watched awestruck by the 3,000-ton monster. Borman, Lovell, and Andrews are due to make the most dramatic space journey in U.S. history, 240,000 miles to the moon, then orbiting 10 times around the moon for 20 hours and sending back live television pictures. Then back to Earth, completing their 8-day journey. But it'll be a tight race. The Russians have a similar mission planned, a swing around the moon for their cosmonauts, and aim to do it before we can, before December. ABC News has now learned that the space agency, in a desperate attempt to beat the Russians, switched the Apollo 8 mission from its original Earth orbit goal. But before the lunar orbit flight can be attempted, our first manned Apollo flight, Apollo 7, this Friday, has to be just about perfect. No gambles will be taken, but every effort will be made to beat the Russians. This is Jules Bergman, ABC, at Cape Kennedy.
The Cardinals are singing the St. Louis Blues tonight, and well they might. The Detroit Tigers evened the World Series 3-3 by beating St. Louis 13-1. ABC's Dave Dials reports from St. Louis. Well, I'm very sorry. We seem to be having some technical difficulties with our report from St. Louis. The Tigers went into today's game with their backs to the wall, with St. Louis leading in the World Series 3-2. It was do or die for them today, and so they did. After putting across 2 runs in the second inning, the Tigers went on to a series record-tying third inning. They scored 10 runs, including Jim Northrup's grand slam homer. The Cardinals tied another mark in that third inning. They used 4 pitchers. Tiger pitcher Denny McLain, who had done very little in the series up until today's game, gave the Cardinals 9 scattered hits, all of them singles, and 1 run. The final score was Detroit 13, St. Louis 1. Tomorrow, the 7th and final game at St. Louis. I'll be back in a moment after this brief message.
Millions of Americans lose half their teeth by age 35. Not from decay, but from gum problems that can start unnoticed at any age. That's why Playtex invented this new toothbrush, to help keep gums as strong as teeth. Most bristles are sharp like this, but each Playtex naturalized bristle is like a tiny brush. So you get hundreds of tiny brushes that not only clean teeth, but massage and exercise gums, for gums as strong as your teeth. New Playtex toothbrush.
You're suddenly shapelier. You're suddenly shapelier. You're suddenly shapelier in a Playtex Cross Your Heart bra. Its secret? This Playtex shaping crosses your heart with stretch to lift and separate. You're suddenly shapelier in a Playtex Cross Your Heart bra. You'll see. Get one and pass the word. You're suddenly shapelier. You're suddenly shapelier.
One more item tonight. At the conclusion of today's White House welcome for New Zealand's Prime Minister Holyoake, the President escorted the Prime Minister to his office, and Patrick Lyndon Nugent joined the parade. Watch. And that's tonight's news. I'm Frank Reynolds. Good night.
Monday through Friday, in color, the ABC Evening News with Frank Reynolds. This has been a presentation of ABC News.